Now we're on Daf Kuf Tesvav Amud Beis, and Baruch Hashem, we're almost out in the clear. We're almost at the finish line, and then it becomes a lot easier. Kid Rav Huna Amar Rav, the Amar of Huna Amar Rav, Asham Shenitak L'Re'iyah Ushchato Stam Kashali Ola. So we have halacha of Nitak L'Re'iyah, which is again one of those sugyas and kachim in Zevachim, which is very complicated in and of itself. And in certain cases, if the carbon is possible, then we don't let it die. We just let it become a balmum, and then we shecht it for what's called kates hamizbeach, which means it's an olah. And whenever the mizbeach is sort of off work, meaning there's no work for the mizbeach because there's no carbonos, then we'll bring it on as a carbon olas nedoch. Okay. So he points out here that we transfer the animal over to a shepherd who takes it out to pasture to graze. And this is what's called nitak l're'iyah. And it's a procedure that's followed by an asham who, let's say, lost his carbon, and then he found another one, then he brought another one in its place and then found the original one, and the original asham is left to graze until it develops a blemish. It's a balas mum, and we sold it for kates hamizbeach. Now, once the animal has been transferred to a shepherd for grazing, it becomes a carbon ola, because as we said before, after it develops a blemish, we're going to use it for a carbon ola, kates hamizbeach. So if somebody goes ahead and slaughters it at this point, even if he has no intention for any particular carbon, it's an ola. Now, with regard to Abraisa, the Gemara is answering that we're discussing a situation in which two animals were set aside for a nazir, let's say asham. Before the nazir reached the point at which he could offer his karbanos, he prematurely slaughtered one of these animals outside the temple as an ola. Ultimately, the nazir's time to bring his sacrifice arrives, and it's kind of like lemafreya, it becomes a carbon ola. Now, he says it emerges in retrospect that the first animal was an asham whose owner received atonement through a different asham, and therefore is valid as an ola if had it brought within the temple. Therefore, he's chayav, this nazir, for slaughtering it outside the temple. Okay. Now, hamala mibsar chatos, so you're not chayav for chutz on halos besar chatos, and the Mishnah gives a whole bunch of cases where he's not chayav for chutz. Ton rabbanim, minay lemala mibsar chatos. Okay, so now the besar chatos is not brought on the eish, but rather it's eaten by the zichrei kuna. And the same is true of B'sar Asham, B'sar Kochikon, and also any carbon that's Kochikon. With B'sar Kochim Kalam, which again, the basar is not burnt on the pyre of the Mizbeach, but rather it's eaten by the Bailim, who are not Kohanim. Mimosar Omer is not brought on the Mizbeach at all. Shtei Lechem is brought on the Shulchan and not, Lechem Apod is brought on the Shulchan. Shtei Lechem is also eaten by the Kohanim, Shari Menachos, eaten by the Zechrei Kahuna, Potter. All these cases, it's Potter because it would not have been brought on the Eish of the Mizbeach. Talmud Lomar, Ola, Ma Ola Shiru'il Allah means the Ola goes up on the fire. Af Kol Haru'il Allah, but in all these above cases, it's not designated for Allah. It's not burnt on the Mizbeach as Aktara, but rather it's eaten by either Kohanim or by Yisrael in the case of Shlomo. Minayin Sha'afa Yotzek. Now we have a list of actions that were performed in the Mikdash as preparatory actions, preparing, as it were, for the Avodah. For example, Yotzek, right? So we know that a mincha is made of solas and shemen, and a Kohen is going to pour the shemen on the mincha. Habolel, right? Also, in the case of Menachos, you have to mix the flour, the solus, with the oil, and that's called belila. And all these actions, if they were done bachutz potter, because it's not yala, it's not brought on the mizbeach. Poses, he takes the mincha, breaks it into pieces. Molech, he salts an offering. Meinif, he does tnufa. Megish, he brings the mincha to the mizbeach. Misader Shulchan, for the Lechem HaPonim, he sets up the Shulchan. Meitiv Saderos, for the Adlakas Neros, he sets up the lamps in the menorah. HaKomes, he does Kmitza. Again, Kmitza might be qualified as an avoda, but it's, as far as Haktorah is concerned, it's only a preliminary stage. I was missing that a few days ago, sorry. If I'm a Kabil, and if he receives the Dam in a Kli Shares, and if he did all, and again, the Kabbalah Sadam is only a preparatory stage to the Eish and the Haktorah, and he did any of the above bachutz, he's potter. Talmud Loma, why is he potter? Asher yala ola o zevach. Because the Torah says yechayev for chutz, for something that should have been brought on the fire and burnt on the mizbeach, ma'alot shehi gmar avoda, and af kol shu gmar avoda. So again, that's going to exclude, number one, the case of something that's not roy lehala, but rather is designated for the achila of the kohanim or the non-kohanim, and something which is not called the gemar ha'avoda, and that's hala, which is the gemar ha'avoda, and all the other activities that we listed here are not concluding avodos, and therefore it's not chayiv bachutz. For example, pouring the oil on a mincha offering, mixing the oil in the mincha, breaking of the mincha into pieces, removing the komets of flour for the mincha. These are all preliminary steps leading up to the final step of placing the komets on the altar to burn. The Mishnah says, Ad shelo hukam mishkan. Right, there was a heter of bamos during the 14 years before they set up the Mishkan, and the avoda was implemented not by Kohanim, but rather by Bechoros. Now, where is a case in the Torah where the Torah records an avoda that was implemented by the Bechoros because it was before the Mishkan was actually erected? And these are the olos that were brought in Matan Torah at the end of Parshas Mishpatim. And who did the avoda? It says, I don't have the pasuk in front of me, it says Ne'arei Bnei Yisrael, and the Ne'arei Bnei Yisrael are the Bechoros, the firstborn. Now, between the time of Ma'abed Har Sinai and the erection of the Mishkan, because the Mishkan was erected in Chodesh Nisan, so from the time of Shavuos, let's say at the beginning of Sivan, until whatchamacallit, until Hakomas HaMishkan on Rosh Chodesh Nisan is 9 months. So during this 9-month period, who was doing the avoda? So it was after Matan Torah, but before Hakomas HaMishkan. That's going to be a machlokas. At what point did the Kohanim take over for the Bechoros? Yosef Rav Huna, Rav Kinan Kamed, Rav Chisda V'Kokari. Here's the pasuk that I wanted to quote before. Vayishlach es nari b'nei Yisrael, and Nari B'nai Yisrael, says Rav Chisda, is a reference to the Bechoros, the firstborn. And this is what he told Rav Huna. And Omar Le, Rav Huna responded to him, Hachi Omar Rav Asi. Rav Asi says, Pasku. In other words, although initially it was Nari B'nai Yisrael, and who did the Avodas HaKorban were the Bechoros, but that ceased. And at that point, the Avodah was transferred from the Bechoros over to the Kohen. Okay, Rashi has two different pshatim here, but we can leave that out for now. We have only 5 minutes left. I want to see how far we can get. Savar lo svune mimasnis. Rav Chisda wanted to ask a kasha from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that the Bechoros continued to serve as Kohanim, to do the Avodah, and they officiated on the Avodah until Hakomas HaMishkan. Shamei Dekoma Mishmei Rav Ada bar Rafa. However, before he got a chance to challenge Rav Huna, he heard in the name of Rav Ada that Ola Shekrivu Yisrael B'Midbar Eina Tu'una Hafshe V'Nituach. Okay, we'll come back to that later. Osvei Braisa Deshavia Lekulo. So that now Rav Chisda challenges Rav Huna from a Braisa, and this Braisa is going to contradict Rav Huna on two different counts. Tisanya, for one count, is Ad Shelo Hukam HaMishkan, Habamos Mutaros Vavodos B'Bechoros. So it means not the way Rav Huna understood it in the name of Rav Asi, that immediately after the Nari B'nai Yisrael brought the Karbonos, officiated at Har Sinai, immediately they were replaced by the Kohen. No, we have a brisa that says that the Bechoros continued the Avodah until Hukam HaMishkan, which is 9 months later. And we'll see another stira in a minute. V'akol ksherim lahakriv behema. And at this point in time, when there was a heter bamos and the Mishkan wasn't brought yet, then any carbon that you brought from anything is okay. Number one, you can bring behema, chayav, ha'of, you can bring zcharim, nekevas, tmimim, balevumim, tahorim. The only thing you're not allowed to bring is lo tmei. Hakol karvu olos. All the karbonos had the status of an olah. The olah shekrivu Yisrael b'midbar tu'una hefshek v'nituach. That's against Rav Huna, who said that olah shekrivu Yisrael b'midbar eina tu'una hefshek v'nituach. So basically, what the Gemara is going to do now is show you that there's a double machlokas between Tanoim. Number one, what point in time did the Kohanim take over from the Bechoros during that nine-month period of time? Was it from Har Sinai or only after Hukam Mishkan? That's a machlokas Tanoim. And then there's going to be another machlokas Tanoim as to whether or not the Olos, which after the Torah was given, after the Mishkan, let's say, was erected, any Olah that you brought did need, right? Whether it did need Hafshata V'Nituach or not. Tanoi. Tisanya, we went to the Brisa of Agam HaKonim Ani Goshim El Hashem Yizkadoshu. So somehow Moshe Rabbeinu was given a command right before Matan Torah to somehow warn the people to keep away from the Har, from the mountain. Because when the Shekhinah is on the mountain, then the Jews are not allowed to come close. And they can't approach the mountain as long as the Shekhinah rested upon it. And now there's a special warning addressed to the Kohanim that they also should keep their distance. And this is a reference to those who performed the Avodah. And they needed a warning because they wanted to assume, well, look, if we do the Avodah, we're entitled to approach the mountain because of our special status. So God had to tell Moshe to warn the Kohanim that they don't have any special status and no one's allowed to go to the mountain. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha Omer, Zo Precious B'choros. That what Moshe Rabbeinu was being told by Hashem is that the Kohanim will replace the Bechoros. That's what he says. Hashem says, V'gam HaKohanim nigoshim al Hashem. So that means that the Bechorim were in charge with the responsibility of performing the avoda, and Hashem says to Moshe to warn them that their status would be paka, would terminate after that point, and the Kohanim would take over. Rebbe says, Zo Precious Nodav Aviv. In other words, Nodav Aviv would perform the avoda at the time of Matan Torah and onwards, and God warns them not to come too close. And unfortunately, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't understand that God was already pretending that in the future they would come too close and they would die, but Moshe didn't understand that. Anyway, now we can understand the pasuk, Hu Asher Dibra Hashem Leimor B'Krovei HaKadosh, that after the death of Nadav Avihu, Moshe tells Aaron that the Kohanim who are Krovai, they come close to Hashem, they shouldn't have overstepped their boundaries, and if they do so, they'll enter into an area they're forbidden to go to, they'll die. El Amandi Omerzu Precious Bechoros, Hecha Remiza. Where's the remez that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu that Nadav Avihu were going to die? I mean, all Moshe Rabbeinu was telling them was precious bechoros, that the bechoros would be replaced by the Kohen. And the Gemara answers, Tichsiv v'no'adati shama livnei Yisrael v'nikdash b'chvodi al tik b'chvodi el b'mchubadai Dav Zamar Kadosh Baruch Hu Moshe. Moshe didn't understand it, that this was a reference to Nadav Avihu. And after they died, Moshe said to Aaron, Achi lo mesu banecha lahakdish shmo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now I understand what it meant when it says v'nikdashti b'mechubadai, as we read it. Kevan shel yoda arat shabonav yodua m'komo is shosak l'kibul schar. So now, from now on, we're going to be learning how the greats of Israel had tragic events in their lives, and yet they were silent. They didn't raise a voice against God, and they got schar. Meaning, I'm not sure who he's referring to by chalom. Maybe it means some of the children of David, or maybe it's referring to some of the soldiers in David's army. He doesn't tell you. At Shsok, and yet David HaMelech remains silent. He doesn't raise a voice of complaint. V'chein Shlomo Omer Eis Lach Shos. This is in Koheles. V'Eis L'Daber Pam Shosei V'Kabel Schar L'Shtika Pam Medaber V'Kabel Schar. So if you talk Divrei Torah, you get schar, and if you're silent in the face of bereavement, then you'll get schar for the silence. One who's bereaved and accepts his suffering without complaint against God is rewarded. Similarly, one who sings to God when he's beneficiary, it's not referring to Torah here, it's referring to Hallel, to be Mahal HaKadosh Baruch Hu when you are the beneficiary of salvation. Hainu Yomer Rav Chia Bar Amar Rabbi Yochanan Ma'idechsiv Nora Elokimi Mikdashecha, and this is a pasuk in Tehillim, and it says Mikdashecha in the plural. It should have said Mi Mikdashcha, right? You're awesome from your sanctuary. What sanctuaries? Al Tigre Mikdashcha El Mi Mikudashecha B'Shasha Osa Kadosh Baruch Hu Din B'Kedoshav Misyare Umisale Umishal. If the people see how God metes out justice to tzaddikim, then they should learn how bad it's going to be for the Rishonim. Elakasha Ola. But we had another contradictory statement whether or not this hafshata in Ola, because Rav Huna said that during the Midbar period, the Ola did not require hafshata, and yet the Brisa says it required hafshata trei tanoi. It's again a machlokas tanoim desanya. Rabbi Yishmael Omer Klolos Nemer B'Sinai Upratos Bi Oel Moed. Right, there's l'chora stira, because on the one hand, Moshe Rabbeinu receives the Torah at Har Sinai, but on the other hand, the Hashem speaks to Moshe through the Ben Akruv in the Old Moed. So where did he get the Torah? So Rabbi Shmuel reconciles this contradiction by saying that the general rules were given at Har Sinai, but the specifics were given in the Old Moed. But Rabbi Kiva says no. Close to Pratos Nemer B'Sinai. Even the Pratos were given at Har Sinai, V'nishnu b'Old Moed, and there was a review in the Old Moed. V'nishtalshu, there was a third time around that all these laws were given in Arvos Moed before they crossed into Eretz Yisrael. So here is a very important footnote, and with that we'll conclude. I'm sorry for the overtime. Anyway, Rabbi Shmuel says that only the general principles of the mitzvahs were taught to Moshe at Har Sinai, and he gives a whole example here. Rabbi Kiva, on the other hand, maintains that even the details of the mitzvahs were taught to Moshe at Har Sinai, and later in the Mishkan, these very same laws were repeated a second time. Moshe Rabbeinu repeated them a third time to the Jews at the Arvos Moed. Here's the punchline. Thus, the challenge of Rav Huna regarding whether there was hafshata and nituach of olos in the midbar can be resolved in the following way. Rav Huna is following Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says that the laws of hafshata and nituach were not revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu until the Mishkan was erected. Let's just go over that one more time. Because according to Rabbi Shmuel, only the clothes were given in Har Sinai, so the pratos were revealed at the time of the Mishkan. So therefore, if we go back to the Karbonos at Har Sinai, at that point of Har Sinai, they only got the clothes, according to Rabbi Shmuel, so they didn't know all the details about Hafshata and Nituah. However, the Brisa follows the view of Rabbi Akiva that all the laws, even the specifics and the details, were given in Har Sinai. So therefore, the Karbonos of Har Sinai, of the Nari B'nai Yisrael that we spoke about, were given and performed with all the details, namely that an Ola needed Hafshata and Nituah. Okay, then, this is where we'll stop, almost here at the end of Kuf Tezvav, Amid Beis, and Emes Hashem will continue tomorrow.